Megan, as she is so good to do, sent me a text on, I think I mentioned this morning it was on Friday, but actually she sent the text on Thursday afternoon and said, what is the sermon going to be about? And I was just up to my nose in alligators at the time, and so at some point on Friday I just gave up and sent her a text that said TBD. Well, as it turns out, I was able to make TBD work. And yet I'm not real happy with that title, but I was kind of forced into it because I didn't like the idea of TBD being to be determined. So the reason I'm not happy with the title is because the Bible really doesn't need my defense. And yet, I think in a culture where ignorance about what the Bible is about and what we really believe, that is rampant. And so, not sure what to call it. Me defending the Bible would be like a mouse defending a lion. The lion probably doesn't need my defense. But that being said, next slide. Kind of the idea behind this, we've got VBS coming up, and we're making Black Hills Church history, and I'm stoked about it. Now, those of you who are Black Hills Church historians, I think this is accurate. We've never had a VBS, as far as I know. Yeah. So this is making Black Hills Church history. I'm sure it'll be in the Rapid City Journal and all sorts of stuff. No, it probably won't be. But that being said, I made the statement in our leadership meeting this morning that I'm going to hijack VBS, and there was a couple of the people who were have really been putting enormous effort into it. Their eyes kind of got that big, and I thought maybe I should have used a different term. And I'm not sure where the term VBS came from. I know, when we were kids, and some of us shared around the table, our memory of Vacation Bible School. Some folks had real positive, things that went on. A few of us Texas kids, maybe not so much. But I do know this, that I'm not sure where the word vacation or the term Vacation Bible School came from. It really isn't what we typically think of when we think of a vacation, right? I mean, when I just throw the word vacation out there, you think going someplace that I don't live and eating out and laying out on a beach or whatever. So that's the term that for vacation. I know that kids are not necessarily all that fired up about Bible or school. And here's a test just to prove that my point. If you shake your kid awake at like 3 o'clock in the morning and say, what would you like to do today? The word Bible and the word school are probably neither one going to come out of their mouth. That's not to say that Bible's not important to our kids. I think it is. I just, so I'm not sure where Vacation Bible School, that terminology came from. And, there's some upsides to, the Vacation Bible Schools that I endured. There were cool people to hang out with, and usually there were treats and that kind of thing. So here's the deal. Typically, and I think you guys will agree that typically when we're teaching kids, and I understand when kids are really young, God made the world is about all their little minds are going to absorb, but at some point, when we start doing the and this, by the way, is our theme. So we're going to be looking at some of the heroes of the Old Testament. And typically the way that we have done things in teaching kids is we read a story out of a book that was written thousands of years ago. We read a story out of that book, and then we make some practical application. And to prove this, so we were talking about this in our Bible class with the young adults this morning, and I asked them about David and Goliath. So what is your takeaway? So this was my question to the young people. What is your takeaway from the story, the biblical narrative of David and Goliath? And you guys can respond if you want to. What do you think the takeaway is from that biblical history?
God's in control.
Pardon?
God's in control.
Well, no, that's not bad. That's not bad. But in fact, it's probably much more accurate to the biblical narrative. The takeaway that, and I'll be honest with you, I mean, growing up, this is what I thought the story of David and Goliath was about. The story of David and Goliath is about the underdog, can win. And so that was, the kids talked about it. In fact, several of them brought up David and the giant pickle. Is that right? Yeah. So, which is not in the biblical narrative anywhere that I can find. In fact, just a quick search, pickle's not even in the Bible. So David and the giant pickle and little guys can do big things, I think was the takeaway. So this is a good example of what I want to discuss, and the next slide will explain why. But for the moment, and I told the kids we're gonna do this in the sermon, so I'm not gonna do this to you twice. But the biblical narrative of David and Goliath goes like this: young kid, brothers off at war. Dad, Jesse, sends the kid, David, who wasn't at war, because why? Well, a couple of reasons. One is he was, kind of the runt of the litter, so to speak. And two, somebody had to take care of the sheep. So the brothers are sent off to war, and they are up against a formidable opponent, being led into battle by Saul, the first king of Israel. And so David is sent with supplies to resupply his brothers who are at war. And when he gets there to the camp of the Israelites, now this is important, the covenant-related people of God. Okay? These people entered into a covenant with Jehovah many years prior, where where they are told, here's what God expects, and they said, all that the Lord commands we will do. And they entered into this covenant at Mount Sinai. And by the way, covenant is kind of a complicated term. We don't use that word very much anymore. What's the difference in a covenant and a contract? Not an awful lot, but covenants usually revolve around the idea of a relationship. We have a HOA in the housing area where we live, and it is a covenant. There's a list of covenants in which my relationship with my next door neighbors is defined, right? So Israel has entered into a covenant relationship with God, and here they are up against a formidable enemy, and the enemy has this big monster giant guy standing out there, and he is railing against the God of Israel. Right? He's standing out there, and he's got his fist in God's face, and he's saying all manner of horrible things about Yahweh. And when David hears it, David says, I love this. David says, this is John Dennis's very rough paraphrase, but David says, give me a sword, I'll go fight that guy. No, David says, why doesn't somebody do something about that? Initially he doesn't say, I'm going to go do something about that. He starts looking for somebody to go do something about that, and when he realizes nobody's going to go, now what is the crime here? What is the thing that needs to be dealt with? The thing that needs to be dealt with is Jehovah is being blasphemed. Jehovah is being slandered by this monster Goliath, right? And so David says, I'm going to go take care of this. I'm going to go deal with this. And you guys know the story. And by the way, the idea that the underdog comes out on top is definitely not a bad brushstroke in the story. But the much more compelling story is that somebody with real biblical faith saw God being slandered, and he said, I'm not going to wait for a men's meeting to discuss this. I'm going to conference right now or die trying. And so David stepped up, and I mean, there are so many, the underdog is not a bad one. Another one that I love, in another brushstroke in that story, is why did the guy pick up 5 stones? I'm asking you, why did he pick up 5 stones? In the biblical narrative, he put a. Anybody ever used a slingshot? I have, and the first few times that I used it, the rock went that way instead of where it was supposed to go. But we were sitting out at Moss Lake in not too far from Big Spring, Texas, and we were all sitting out there around the campfire, and we were playing with a slingshot. And it's kind of amazing that we all came back with both the eyes we were born with. But David was accomplished at this, as we know from other aspects of David's life. So why did he pick up 5 rocks? And the answer is, huh? What? Well, and you guys are all right. The Bible doesn't say why he picked up 5 rocks. My My belief is that he picked up 5 rocks because he didn't know the first rock was going to find its mark. He didn't know how this was going to turn out. He thought it could be a running, I started to say gun battle, but running rock battle. Which is, by the way, consistent with the biblical narrative. I mean, like our Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or as my dad used to call it, Shadrach, Meshach, and to bed we go. If Dad were here, you guys could give him a hard time with it. But they had kind of that same idea, this idea that we don't know how this is going to end, but regardless of how it's going to end, right? We're not going to kneel. We're not going to. But the question is, why did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say we're not going to kneel? Well, they said they're not going to kneel. They're not going to take a knee because Jehovah, this is so important, because Jehovah deserves better. That's the story of David. David sees what's going on, God's people quivering in their armor, and he says some version of, Jehovah deserves better than this. And I am going to take care of it. Now that is the real biblical narrative of the story of David. It revolves, but I mean, by the way, I don't know how many sermons, genuinely hundreds probably, through the years that I've heard on David and Goliath, almost every one of them. So the idea that was brought up in class this morning, that the underdog's going to come out on top, if you trust in God or whatever. Most of them end with something like this. What is the Goliath in your life? Well, my boss is my Goliath in my life, or whatever, right? I mean, and then, well, faith in God, you'll overcome that Goliath. Well, I mean, part of the problem with that, and I'm honest, if you don't hear anything else I say, you got to hear this. Part of the major theological problem with that being our takeaway is that it's me-centric. It's about me. Well, I've got this problem in my life, and it's big, and I'm little, but if I have faith in God, I'm gonna beat that thing. Well, and by the way, I mean, there's lots of passages that say, God's with you, and He's going to provide what you need, and all of that. So, but the problem with this is David didn't go up against Goliath because David was thinking about David. David went up against Goliath because Jehovah deserves better than this. His people should have said, no, you are not going to say those kinds of things about Jehovah. We have a covenant with that guy. Next slide. I keep forgetting I don't have the thing. I love this little cartoon. I wish I knew where I got it. I don't remember. But I need, especially the young people, I need you to take a look at this. And we're going to kind of take this apart for just a second. So you've got these two opposing forces. And you've got the folks whose worldview is built on autonomous human reasoning. So autonomous human reasoning is, I don't need God, we don't need churchy stuff, we don't need the Bible, we can figure this stuff out ourselves. And by the way, the biblical narrative says that began on page 1, well, just about, on page 1 of your Bible. It began with humanity reaching out and grabbing a hold of the tree of knowledge of good and evil because they would prefer to cipher all of this morality stuff out on their own instead of having God explain it to them and having that relationship with God. So we left the garden. Our great-great-grandparents left the garden in search of autonomous human reasoning. So this is just outstanding. And then you've got this group of people on the other side whose worldview is built on the revelation of God's Word. Now this is so astute. Again, I wish I knew who did this, because and if you notice, the banners or the balloons that they've got flying above, and there's probably 100 others that could go up there, and it doesn't matter. This is so typically what the Christian worldview has been about for the last 150 years. It's been about shooting at the banners at the top of the right, and I love each of these guys. This guy, is, hey, I got one, and this guy here has figured out that cannon is a good place to put his pillow and take a nap. This guy doesn't have a clue what he's doing. He's shooting in the opposite direction. But if you notice what the folks on the autonomous human reasoning side of the conflict are doing, they are pounding away at the revelation of God's Word. And is it working? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And this whole idea of shooting at each one of these issues as they pop up, what I call the whack-a-mole approach. Anybody in here ever played that game? Does this work? The whack-a-mole approach? No. Primarily because the real issue, the autonomous human reasoning, is a flawed worldview that is so susceptible to our dismantling it if we would just make a case. But for some reason, we don't. We want to talk about this stuff. We want to talk about abortion and euthanasia and moral relativism and all of that. And by the way, especially for those who may be seeing this on the web, I don't think there's anything wrong with us talking about that on occasion. But the overarching issue is that we are allowing the world to chisel away at the idea that the Bible is God's Word and it has real authority in every aspect of my life. Right? I asked my kids this morning, and I asked, by the way, I always do, I ask them, is it okay if I share this stuff? And they said yes. So I'm not gossiping. They were cool with me sharing this. But I asked the kids, why are you a believer? And man, the answers, I've either done this before or seen it done a zillion times. And the answers were so good. Thank God. And thank the parents. The answers were so good. We absolutely, well, let me just tell you. They basically fell into two categories, and I love this. And my first point, and by the way, this was the first point even before, I already had this done before I came to church this morning. My first point is a story vacuum. But the answers, why are you a believer, and coming from our kids, the answers fell into two categories. One of them was, a very well thought out, what we call an apologetic. That doesn't mean that they're making apologies. It means that they're making a good argument for from a logical point of view, why they were believers in Jehovah. I love that. And it was exceptionally well done. So there's hope. If you guys will hold on to that and not let the world take it away from you, there's hope that the next generation, maybe we can reverse the whack-a-mole approach to things. The second approach, which has typically been shunned by churches of Christ, the second approach was their own personal story. This is what I'm going to get emotional here because this is so important. The story, the idea was, this is what I've seen God do in my life. And we Church of Christ folks have been so logical and so methodical with so many things. And we've kind of ironed out of the equation, to mix a metaphor, we've kind of removed from the equation what other groups would call testimony. And we've got our theological reasons for shunning testimony, which is bizarre because if you look at Genesis to the maps, it's pretty much all somebody's testimony. This is what God did in my life. Or this is what God's been doing in our life, right? And I know, as soon as we let people start talking, and they run away with the whole thing and say stuff we're uncomfortable with. And we've got a lot of reasons. This is our typical church experience. Come to class. We're not sure what it was designed to do, but we come to class, and then after that, we sing some songs, a quick prayer or two, and then we have crackers with grape juice, and then another long education piece, and then we have potluck. That's our. For the majority of us, that is the sum total of what church has been for the last, as far back as you can remember. And yet, if you look at what appears to be the norm for the first century church, they didn't have a professional orator standing up there talking. They would just sit and listen to Gloria talk about what God's doing in her life. So, in conclusion, and I've got to do this quick, we have this idea, I say we, culturally I think, there is this idea that the Bible, at least the way John sees it, so the culture sees me as believing that, God wrote this book and He drops it down on the planet, and if I read it and I do it, then I can pass go and collect $200 instead of go to jail. That's kind of the culture's view of what I think. And and the Bible is really just a list of rules and regulations, and if I follow them, then I go to the good place, and if I don't follow them, then I go, someplace else. But I've already alluded to this, and I'm going to underline it again. This idea that the biblical narrative, oddly enough, the biblical narrative is not primarily about you. The biblical narrative is primarily about Jehovah and about the fact that He deserves better than this. And we have a covenant relationship with Him, and that covenant defines every layer, every aspect of our life. And there's real authority in that. Jesus Christ, we did this morning, thank God, and it was awesome. Jesus deserves, having paid the price for my wickedness, and there's plenty of it. Jesus deserves to have authority to direct, not just the stuff that I say, God, I don't know if I can do this, you do it. I mean, most of us in here would sign up for that, right? That I'll run 98% of my life, and just the stuff that seems to be not working very well, you can run it, right? But the biblical mandate is that Jesus has the authority. Matthew chapter 28. All authority. How much authority? All authority has been given me in heaven and on earth. And we've typically jumped right to the go and make disciples and baptize them thing, which there's nothing wrong with that. But we've stopped looking at this idea that Jesus demands of his disciples that he has how much authority? 98% of the authority. That he has all authority. That he gets to decide for me what's best for me, which is 180 degrees from that autonomous human logic thing that we were looking at a little while ago. See, we wind up in two completely different places. The watershed is the Scriptures. If you get on one side of the Scriptures and you say, well, that's a bunch of, convenient little stories that, encourage us to take stands against our boss or whatever. And just in case my boss happens to tune into this on the web, I suppose I should say, I love you, man. So just for time's sake, I'm not gonna do this. Do you guys know? And the hand's already up there. Do you know where the first place where the Bible talks about the Bible being written? If I were to ask you that question, maybe you would know. The answer is in Exodus chapter 17, verse 8 and 9, and then in verse 14, where the children of Israel are going up against, I believe it was the Amalekites, if I remember correctly. And in Exodus chapter 17, Moses says, I'm going to stand up on the hill and I'm going to hold my hands up. Do you guys remember that? And then there's this idea that, his arms were getting heavy, and so he'd drop them down, and things weren't going very well in the battle. So a couple of guys stand up there and hold his hands up. Do you guys remember that? That's a weird story, isn't it? I mean, we were talking about this in Bible class this morning too. There's a lot of those kind of weird stories. But then, after that, in verse 14 of Exodus chapter 17, God says, write this in a scroll so you guys remember. Interesting, isn't it, that he didn't say, here's a bunch of rules and regulations I want you to write in the scroll. What he said was, I want you to remember what God did in this particular place at this particular time. It was a testimony. It was a testimony about what God did in a difficult time in the life of the children of Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, conclusion here, just jump over there with me. I want you to look at this, and then we'll be done. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 20. You've probably heard this before, but there's this statement in Deuteronomy where it says, in the future, when your son asks you what is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God has commanded you. So I want you to stop there for just a second. And I don't remember the rabbi's name, but he's a relatively modern day guy who is probably still living. He wrote a piece on this which I thought was just so intriguing. He says, from a Hebrew point of view, if you don't understand this if you don't understand kind of the tone. And he said there is this young kind of arrogant tone to this young man who's asking his dad, and it goes like this. In the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of the stipulations and decrees and the laws the Lord our God has commanded you? Right? So there's some skepticism and just kind of the arrogance of youth. And Dad says, and I love this, he doesn't answer the question, what are the meanings of all these rules and regulations? And Dad says, what is this? This is testimony. We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord did something about it. Right? So the biblical narrative, yeah, there's some rules and regulations, but the biblical narrative is not, here's what you have to do in order to not go to the bad place and to go to the good place. The biblical narrative from Genesis pretty much to the book of Revelation is all about what God's doing right now. What He's motivating Dan Green to do, and what He's motivating Charlie and Carla and John and Gloria. It's about us making a difference now, not waiting for something 10 years or 20 or 30 years from now. I mean, I am waiting for that too. But the biblical narrative is so much more compelling than just a small little me-centric, if you're the underdog and you trust God, you'll come out on top. Well, sometimes that's the case. Sometimes the underdogs who trust God come out on top. Sometimes, on the other hand, Jesus, it would be a good example, right? Who was the underdog, trusted in God, and they nailed him to a tree outside Jerusalem. So sometimes the underdogs, don't necessarily come out on top. But I can tell you this, the biblical narrative is so much deeper and so much more compelling than we've given it credit for being. And if we want the next generations to be shooting at the foundation of the autonomous human reasoning folks, not shooting at the folks, just shooting at the foundation of their worldview, it's got to be more compelling and a little more richer, I think. All right.